I'm going to share a reflection from the book of Jonah. And really, the book of Jonah is a short book. It's only 3 chapters, but it is rife with a lot of lessons that I really didn't give a lot of careful consideration to until recently when I spent some time in it. And so I'm just going to read Jonah chapter 1, verse 1 through 3. And then I'm going to read Jonah chapter 3, verse 1 through 3. So Jonah chapter 1, verse 1 through 3. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Jonah chapter 3, verse 1 through 3. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now, people that usually read the book of Jonah are very familiar with the fact that Jonah initially ran away from the call of God, initially ran away from the responsibility and the task that God had given him, which was to go and preach to the Ninevites and to preach a message of repentance. Now, clearly, Jonah decided against going to Nineveh the first time he was asked because he had some personal convictions. He had some misgivings about how the Ninevites were, and he didn't feel that they were deserving of mercy from God. Now, I can tell you that any individual who has answered the call to ministry, if any of them tell you that they initially received the call from God and went straight to seminary and did not initially run away from that call, they are probably being disingenuous. I can tell you personally that I was likely called to ministry in 2004. I heard the discernible voice of God tell me that I was called to ministry, and of course, usually when you hear the call to ministry, it is often confirmed by those who know you best, who have been around you. And it was confirmed by other deacons, by the pastor at the time. There were people who confirmed this call that I had to ministry in 2004. Now, mind you, I didn't go to seminary until the spring of 2016. And so I'm going to get to what happened between 2004 and 2016 in just a moment. But before I share that personal testimony, I do want to share my observations from Jonah. The first thing is that Jonah, I don't think, really understood that God is omniscient. When God is omniscient, it means that God knows all things. And I think that we do the same thing. We assume that God, when God says what God says, that we believe that God couldn't have been right about what he is saying. God couldn't have been right when we were called to do this, or sent to go here, or leave a place of familiarity. We hear very many examples in the Bible. We read about many examples in the Bible where people left places of familiarity, where they went into battle with less than the amount of warriors that they thought that they needed. When people were able to collaborate and build and rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the walls, with very little in resources, we just see plenty of examples of when God have called people in the Bible to do things that just from the human perspective didn't make sense. And so we often, like Jonah, feel like God is not omniscient, knowing all things. And that can be challenging because when we ignore the fact that God is omniscient, we fail to recognize that God sees a bigger picture than we are willing to see or are capable of seeing. We are dealing with the task at hand, and God is looking at everything that is impacted by what we are tasked to do. And so we're looking at the initial move, but God is looking at the entire chessboard. So God is omniscient. The second thing is that Jonah, I don't think, realized God's omnipresence, meaning that God is everywhere. Jonah thought that if he left and went down to Tarshish, that somehow God would not be able to find him there. And I do believe that we often, in our humanness, we believe that if we just hide from God and we avoid what God has told us, we avoid the responsibility or the task that God has placed on our heart, that if we go somewhere else, if we move to another church, if we leave a particular neighborhood, if we switch jobs, that somehow the task or the responsibility that we'll be able to run away from it and to hide from God. And God is omnipresent. God is everywhere. So wherever it is that we decide to try to hide, we can't hide. Now, the third thing is that Jonah, I don't really understood the concept of omnipotence, meaning that God is all-powerful. God's power and grace can turn even the most unworthy person around. And if you look at the story of Jonah, you'd recognize that the part of the reason why he ran away from this call is because he didn't feel that the people God was asking him to go preach to were deserving of the grace and mercy of God. So Jonah failed to recognize the omnipotence of God, that God's power is capable of overcoming the what we might call the unworthiness of somebody else. And we do that often as human beings. We view certain individuals a specific kind of way based on where they came from, the color of their skin, maybe even the job title that they have. We categorize and label people such that we view them through the prism or the lens of their worst attributes. And we often will compare those worst attributes that we are viewing to the best version of ourselves that we can potentially present. And so we seem to have a proclivity, as my pastor would use, is one of his favorite words, a proclivity towards generalizing and categorizing and labeling people such that we only view them from an unworthy lens. And so, to summarize, Jonah didn't understand God's omniscience. He didn't understand that God knows all things. God is looking at the chessboard when we're just looking at one chess move. Jonah didn't recognize or understand God's omnipresence, that God is everywhere at the same time. God will find you no matter where you try to run. Finally, Jonah, didn't understand God's omnipotence, meaning that God is all-powerful, that the power of God is capable of extending grace even to those who we deem unworthy. So now, going back to my personal testimony, I do want to share this. As I mentioned earlier, I was called to ministry in 2004. At the time, I thought that ministry for me meant that I was going to become this hip-hop artist, this world-famous hip-hop artist, and that I was going to use my relationship with God to share the gospel with other people. And that seems like a worthy aspiration, but again, I thought I knew better than God. I thought that what I was trying to do was that was the ministry that God was calling me to, and it wasn't. And I tried unsuccessfully for several years to try to get into the music industry, and several dollars and failed attempts later, I was unable to break through. And eventually I was resigned to the fact that I was just going to do music as a hobby, and I was going to have more Christian themes in that music and just use it as a tool to minister to young people. Then I thought, I'm going to become this Wall Street executive, and I'm going to use that as the platform to be able to share the gospel. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think that my perspective was off because I ended up going to business school, and at the time when I graduated from business school, all the jobs on Wall Street went away because of the Great Recession. And so it was a worthy aspiration, but again, because I was focusing on the omnipresent, I wasn't focusing on the omniscience of God, that God knew all things. That was the way for me to be able to fulfill this call, quote unquote. Now, I left the church that I grew up in and went to the church that I attend now. And so that's where the omnipresence idea comes into play, is that I thought that by running away that I would be able to avoid this call. And so I kind of resigned myself to being in banking and just kind of doing my thing and not really pursuing the call that God had placed on me back in 2004. And when you get to 2014, a couple of days before my birthday, I had a car accident. And when I tell you that if you saw the way the car looked, and you saw that I was able to get out of that accident without a single scratch on my body, if you didn't know God then, you would know God just based off of that particular testimony all by itself. But it was at this point that I realized that life is so short, and I need to stop running from what God has called me to do. And so I decided within myself at that point that, God, if you help me to find my life partner, if you allow me to be able to have the opportunity to settle down with my wife, then I will commit to going to the seminary, and I will commit everything that I do to you. And I decided at that moment I was going to go to seminary. And I got accepted into the seminary I currently attend, New Brunswick Theological Seminary, in the fall of 2015, and then I matriculated into the seminary in the spring of 2016. And so, ever since me getting into seminary, several things have happened. I've been able to become a successful business owner as a financial advisor, and I'm still growing, but we can see the seeds of flourishing going on right now. I'm a lot more self-assured in the call and what I'm supposed to do. There are a lot of things that have settled themselves and have become more apparent from a ministry perspective, and even just from the perspective of having clear vision. And so I say all that to suggest that, if you are being called right now into anything, if you can sense that God is steering you towards something, then I would encourage you to follow that voice of God. Don't delay. Don't take so many detours as I did. Because when you have those detours, it hinders the progress that God intends for you to have. And if you'll notice, if you read on to what Jonah did, Jonah was able to save many people in Nineveh as a result of him following through on what God asked him to do. And so I close by telling you all, be encouraged. Recognize that when the call of God is on your life, that you have to acknowledge God's omniscience. God knows all. Recognize God's omnipresence, because God will be able to find you wherever you try to run. And God's omnipotence, meaning that God has the power to be able to do exactly what God intends to do through you to the benefit of many others. And I hope this blesses you. I ask that you reflect on this idea, follow the call of God, learn from the example of Jonah, and quite frankly, learn from my own personal testimony. You will be much better for it. You take care and be blessed.